Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we continue our study of the second book of Kings, that is Malachim Bet. We are about to begin chapter 17, that is Perek Yud Zayin. Now, this is a very depressing chapter, very sad, very tragic. In this chapter, we're going to divide it into two parts, but this chapter deals with the end and the destruction and the exile of the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom. All this time we've been studying together the parallel histories of the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah after they separated and split apart during the reign of the son of Solomon, Rehavam, when Yeravam or Jeroboam led a rebellion and divided what was the united kingdom under David and Solomon and Saul. Before that became the split kingdom and eventually became two separate kingdoms. And as we've seen this entire time, the northern kingdom, despite having been instructed by God consistently through his prophets, through Elijah, through Elisha, through Hosea, through many prophets, through Jonah, over that time period, they still did not get their act together. There was no rays of hope. Every single king, one was worse than the next. Every leader was worse than the next. The people themselves had this corruption built into their system, and we're about to read this narrative of the end of that kingdom. So let's read it. It's sad, but it's important. Here we go. Bishnas Deshtem Esrei, in the 12th year of Achaz Melech Yehuda, of the reign of Achaz, the king of Judah, who we just read about in the last chapter. Malach Hosea ben Elah, that was when the king Hosea, the son of Elah, and this is very different Hosea than the Hosea the prophet that we just spoke about before. This is Hosea the king, the last king Bishomron in Samaria, which was the capital city of the kingdom of Israel. Al Yisrael, he ruled over Israel Tesha Shanim for 9 years. And like I've said many times, I'm not concentrating during this podcast at all on the number, on these years and on the chronology, which doesn't seem to work. It doesn't add up. With what we've seen in other chapters, 12 years of this, 9 years of that, it doesn't seem to add up. There's various explanations as to how this happened exactly like this, but I'm not going to go into that. What the narrative here is much more important. Vayas hara be'einei Adonai, he did bad in the eyes of God. Rak, however, lo k'malchei Yisrael asher hayu lefanav, but he wasn't quite as bad as the other kings of Israel that preceded him before him. In what way was he not as bad? Ironically, this is one of the first times we hear about a king being not quite as bad, having some redeeming factors. And what were they? We're going to see in a little bit some of the things that he did that made him a little bit more better, a little bit better to God than the previous kings that preceded him. But before we read that, Allah Shalmaneser Melech Ashur, Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria. So Assyria, as we've been saying until now, has been steadily rising in power and conquering the other nations. And as we stated before, all of the smaller nations tried to create an alliance against Assyria, but they were unsuccessful. So as Assyria conquered those smaller nations, Aram, Israel, Tyre, the Philistines, those nations who tried to rise against the Assyrians were unsuccessful, so they conquered and attacked the northern kingdom of Israel and subjugated them. Vayihilo Hoshea Eved, and Hoshea became subservient to them. He became a vassal king. Vayashiv lo mincha, and he paid them a tribute in order to to allow Hoshea to remain a king, though a vassal, not truly independent anymore at all. Now, Hoshea decided, very unwisely, to rebel against Assyria. Vayimsa melech Ashur b'Hoshea kesher. And the king of Assyria found out, discovered that Hoshea had conspired against him by doing what? Asher sholach malachim el so melech Mitzrayim. He sent messengers to create an alliance with the other superpower at the time, which was Egypt. He tried to sign an alliance with them against Assyria. So he stopped paying tribute Lamelech Ashur kishana b'shana to the king of Assyria like he did on a yearly basis. So vayatzireu melech Ashur vayatzireu beis kela. So the king of Assyria came and arrested Hoshea. Vayal melech Ashur b'chol haaretz, and the king of Assyria attacked the entire land of Israel. Vayal Shomron, and he came to the capital city of Samaria. Vayatzar aleh shalosh shanim, and he laid siege to the city for 3 years. This is all the time while the king himself wasn't even in leadership. The king himself was in jail. Vishnas Hachias, in the 9th year Hoshea of Hoshea's reign, Lochad melech Ashur at Shomron. Melech, the king of Assyria, captured the capital city of Samaria. Vayegel es Yisrael Ashura, and he exiled the people of Israel to Assyria. Vayoshev osam, and he settled them Bachlach uvichavor nahar Gozan v'Arei Madai. Now over here, remember, it's saying the king of Assyria. It doesn't name him Shalmaneser, and we know from extra biblical sources, from writings and wall carvings that are found in the capital of Assyria, Nineveh, which is modern-day Mosul, Iraq. And those records discuss the capture of the northern kingdom of Israel by Sargon II, who succeeded Shalmaneser. And he was the king that actually did this from history. Now, other things we found have shed light, archaeological findings have shed a tremendous amount of light on what happened here. And it does describe the exile of the people of Israel, and the description describes just under 30,000 people that are numbered and written in the Assyrian documentation were taken from the northern kingdom and exiled into the lands of Assyria. Now, this exile was Assyria's policy. When they wanted to subjugate a nation and incorporate it into their empire, what they would do would be exile the people and scatter them, so to decrease the likelihood and possibility that they would eventually band together, continue their culture, their religion, their language, and eventually band together and maybe one day again be a threat to Assyria. So by exiling them, this would be what happened. And what it seems is, and especially since the people of Israel seem to pop up later, there seems to be people still within the northern kingdom of Israel. And we're going to talk in the next podcast, in the second half of this chapter, what exactly happened to the masses. It seems that what happened here was the people of the capital, Samaria, were taken, and the leadership were taken, similar to what we find about 150 years later when the kingdom of Judah was initially subjugated by the Babylonians, who the Babylonians down the road are eventually going to conquer Assyria, and they'll be the dominant empire. They exiled the leadership and left the masses there to tend the farms, to continue living there. They just exiled the leadership in order to subjugate the population. So it's very likely that that's the same thing that happened here, and that explains why there are still people of Israel in the area of the northern kingdom, and what happened to them, what they did, and so on, we're going to read about soon. Now, I promised that I would mention what exactly it was that Hoshea did that made him not quite as bad as the other kings. And we know from the book of Chronicles that what he did was he removed the obstacles of the northern kingdom, the people in the northern kingdom, from going down to pray at the temple in Jerusalem. In other words, he allowed for people that were faithful to God to return to Jerusalem in order to worship God at the one temple in Jerusalem and be influenced by the Judeans, who were still more loyal to serving God. Now, and this in the rabbinic literature, it is stated that once he removed those obstacles and the people still didn't care to go, that just showed just how low they had fallen. Now, as we read the next several verses, I want to point out some things that are very important, things that I've been pointing out throughout this podcast. And really the most important point that I want to make in this podcast, really, like pretty much the principle of the Bible, and that is that what's wrong with worshiping other gods, right? What does that mean? Obviously, there's one true God. So worshiping other gods is rebelling against him. But it's way, 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 way deeper than that. And it's way much more important than that. And the issue is, and we see this repeatedly throughout the Bible in many places, and we're about to read it again here, which is why I'm pointing it out. And that is that once, if we recall what Maimonides teaches us about what does it mean when God says, I only want you to sacrifice within the temple? I don't want you to have places to sacrifice in other places. The point was that God wanted to separate the people from that type of worship, right? And the way that type of worship, which is I have to sacrifice to the gods in order to get God's favor. The point of the Bible, the point of the Torah is to teach us that we don't get God's favor by sacrificing things to him, by giving things to him. He doesn't need stuff. We get God's favor, so to speak, or we improve ourselves and improve the world around us, and by doing the right things and acting the right way, by keeping God's laws, by keeping the morals and ethics which God teaches us, living the way by being good, by being kind, by being empathetic. Most importantly, the two key things: justice and righteousness. That is how, and the prophets at this very time, this is what they were trying to teach the people, right? Tzedek umishpat was when we read through the 12 minor prophets, and the prophets who were prophesying at exactly this time, this is what they were teaching, right? So, and the more you believe, the minute you start making bamot, the minute you start bringing sacrifices outside of the one place, right? Then you start thinking, well, I could sacrifice to God here. I could sacrifice to God there. The next thing you start doing is, well, I can sacrifice to another God. I can sacrifice to another God. And the next thing you start doing is divination and necromancy and all kinds of things, because what you're thinking is, the way I get favor from God is not by acting differently, not by living differently, not by being a good person, but by giving things to God that God wants, right? Supposedly, as if God wants things. It's a completely messed up theology and idea. And the next thing that happens is you want to give God the most valuable thing that you have, and that's your children and other human beings, which leads to human sacrifice, which is the most abominable level to which this philosophy leads to. So we're going to read that very descent as the description and understanding of the problem with the northern kingdom of Israel. And we're also going to read that the southern kingdom of Judah also made a similar mistake, right? And also allowed for sacrifices outside of the temple. However, the kingdom of Judah didn't quite fall quite so low, as we're going to see in the next chapter when we read of the king Hezekiah, who was able to rescue the people from the abyss. So here we go. It's kind of very scary and frightening, but here we go. Verse 7. When the children of Israel sinned to the God, the Lord their God, Hama'aleh Osama Eretz Mitzrayim, the God who took them out of the land of Egypt, mitachat yad Paro melech Mitzrayim, right? Vayiru Elohim achirim, and they worshipped and saw other gods. Vayelchu b'chukot hagayim, and they went according to the ways. This is the key thing. The worshiping of other gods leads one to act in the ways of those other nations. Asher horish Adonai b'pnei bnei Yisrael, those nations which God got rid of from the land before the people of Israel because of their corrupt ways. Umachei Yisrael asher asu, and the customs of the kings of Israel, right, which they did like them. In other words, because the kings of Israel were also evil in the way that we just described. Vayechapu v'nei Yisrael dvarim asher lo chen. Now this is, the word chen means right or true, right? I'm going to translate it here as true. The people of Israel committed and did things that are not true, al Adonai Elohim, against the Lord their God. In other words, they went to things that were false. This is the crucial point here. The crux of the worship of God is seeking truth, right? Not going, because this philosophy of giving sacrifices to God is fundamentally as false can be. Of thinking that you can curry favor by giving things to this God or that God. This is the very definition of falsehood. The first thing they did was build bamot, they built bamot, they built high places, they built altars in all of their cities, from the places where they had watchtowers to the fortified cities, all over the place, they built these things. Then what happens after that? Bamot aren't necessarily bamot, right? Adds altars to other gods. They often could be altars to God himself, but the next step then becomes then they start setting up pillars, meaning things to worship, va'asherim, and trees to worship. Al kol giva gavo, on every high hill, v'tachas kol eitz ranon, and underneath every shady tree. Excuse me. Vayikatru sham b'chol bamos, and then they started to bring incense and sacrifices on all of those altars. Kagoyim asher hagla Adonai mipneihem, just like those nations were doing, that God sent them out of the land of Israel in order for the people of Israel to come, because those people were so corrupt. Vayasud dvarim reim, and they did terrible, evil things. La'achis es Adonai, things which made God angry. Vayavdu hagilulim, and they worshipped these gilulim, which we translated sometimes as these images, right? Asher Amar Adonai Elohem, that God had already told him, Lo sasu es hadavar, that do not do these things. Vaya'ad Adonai b'Yisrael u'v'Yehuda, and God had testified against the people of Israel and the people of Judah, biyad kol nevi'eh, in the hands of all of the prophets, kol chozeh, all of the seers, lemar, saying as follows: Shuvu midarchechem araim, turn away from your evil ways. V'shimru, and what should you do? It doesn't say bring sacrifices to me. It says v'shimru mitzvosai chukosai, and keep my commandments and my laws. K'chol haTorah, like all of the teachings asher tzivisi es avosechem, that I commanded your forefathers. V'asher shalachti alechem b'yad avadai neviim. If you remember reading those Nevi'im, those are the Nevi'im who talk about the oppression of the poor, they talk about the tzedek u'mishpat, justice and righteousness. Those Nevi'im, those prophets that we've studied together for the past few years of this podcast, right? God told you, keep those laws, be good people, be kind, be just, build proper societies. That's what God wanted us to do. That's why he gave us the Torah, in order to teach us to do those things. I don't want those kind of sacrifices. I don't want those kinds of future telling. And you'll see what I mean, why I said that in a minute. But they didn't listen. Vayakshu et arpam k'oref avosam, and they turned their necks they stiffened their necks just like their forefathers did. Asher lo ha'aminu b'Adonai Elohim, because they did not have faith in the Lord their God. Vayimasu et chukav, they turned away. They were disgusted with God's laws, ves briso, and the covenant asher karas avosam, that he did. Which he made with their forefathers, ves eid vosav, and his witnesses asher he'id bahem. In other words, witnesses here meaning like warnings, testimonies that God said to them, that if you act this way, this will be the result. Vayelchu acharei hahevel, and they went after nonsense, right? Vayehabalu, and they became caught up in delusions. V'acharei hagoyim asher sivosam, and they went after the nations that surrounded them. Instead of going after truth, instead of searching truth, they searched for delusions. They went to these delusional concepts and ideas. God commanded people not to go after this delusional falsehood. And they forsook all of the rules of the Lord their God. And they went and they made 2 golden calves. And they made trees to worship. And they bowed to all of the stars of the heaven. And they worshipped the Baal, the Baal, which was the Canaanite deity. And what did all of that lead to? It led to the worst of all. and they sacrificed their sons and their daughters in flame. Vayiksemu ksamim, and they went to magical divination, vayinacheshu, and incantations, vayismakru, and they sold themselves to evil, lasos hara, to do evil, ve'enei Adonai, the things that were evil in the eyes of God, lachiso, things which made God angry. So you see here what I was saying the whole time. The point is, it starts off with a bama, with an altar outside the temple. That's how it starts. And then it turns to sacrificing to other gods. And then it turns to sacrificing the most valuable, most precious things, people's children themselves. Human sacrifice is something which is found in almost every primitive society. Because when this is the key achievement of monotheism, is telling people that this is not what God is interested in. What God is interested in is in our actions and how we live. This is the key teaching of the Torah. And I know we've said this many times, that the Torah says this so many times over and over and over again. If you want to know what God wants from you, He wants you to be a good person. He wants you to keep the laws that He commanded. And we already said, what are those laws? The last thing He wants is vayiksemu ksamim, is magical incantations, trying to tell the future by all these magical things. This is not what God wants, right? God doesn't want people trying to tap into this false spirituality, and this is not real. This is not true. These are delusions. But this became so ingrained in the people of Israel, despite God's warnings, repeated warnings over and over and over again. And now that they had the chance to start to return to God, to start to go back to Jerusalem, they were so far gone that they weren't even interested. Therefore, Vayisanaf Adonai Ma'od B'Yisrael, God became extremely angry against the people of Israel, Vayisirei Me'al Panav, and He banished them from His face. Lo nishar rak shevet Yehuda levado, the only one that remained intact, or at least that the leadership remained intact, was the tribe of Judah alone. However, just you should know, Gam Yehuda lo shamar et mitzvos Adonai Elohim. Judah was also not keeping the rules of the commandments of God. Vayelchu b'chukos Yisrael asher asu, they also were doing the things that the people of Israel had done. That's kind of a little interlude, like a little. It's kind of an injection into this narrative to know. Don't think I'm trying to tell you that Yehuda was so great, as we know from the words of the prophets of the time, from reading the book of Isaiah, who was prophesying in Judah. We know that they also were corrupt. They also were had the same sins. But as we'll see in the behavior of the kings of Yehuda, and as we've seen until now in the behavior of the kings of Yehuda, every time there was an evil one or two or three kings, there was always a good one who came back, who tried to pull the people back. There was still hope. And the people, there was enough of the leadership listening, enough of the people listening, that there's hope to bring them back. But the people of Israel there was nothing to point back to. There was no good. Vayimas Adonai b'chol zera Yisrael, and God was disgusted with, that would be, I guess, the best translation of Vayimas, of all of the children of Israel, Vayanem, and He punished them, Vayitnem b'yad shosim, and He placed them under the control of people that came to plunder, Ad asher ashlicha mipanav. In other words, that refers to the years when they were subservient to Assyria, until He finally just banished them. Why? Ki kara Yisrael me'al beis David, because ultimately it goes back to the beginning of the history of the northern kingdom of Israel, because Israel had torn themselves away from the house of David, Vayamlichu at Yerovam ben Nevat, and they made Jeroboam, the son of Nevat, a king. Now the key thing here is, remember, when Yerovam ben Nevat, when Jeroboam was originally made king, it was at first done by the words of a prophet, God Himself. It was the decision, though. So, but however, because the people and Yerovam, when God made Yerovam king, it was apparent when we studied this together that Yerovam was meant to be a king, to be a counterweight to Rechavam, Solomon's son, who was corrupt himself, and somehow they should have worked together to bring the people back together, right? It wasn't meant to tear them away. It was Yerovam's decision to drive the people towards idol worship and away from God in order to tear them apart. That was a decision that God didn't make. That was a decision that Yerovam and hence the people of the kingdom of Israel made. Vayadach Yeravam et Yisrael me'achrei Adonai. As the verse says right now, as the point I was making, comes from these words because it says here, Vayadach, it was Yeravam who pushed Israel away from God, and caused them to do a terrible sin. And as we've learned so many times, every single king of the northern kingdom of Israel that succeeded Yeravam, whether by being his descendant or by ascending to power through another coup, which we've seen repeated ones, each continued in the sins of Yeravam. And the people of Israel are also responsible. It wasn't just the leader, because they, lockstep, walked in the path that Yeravam led them. They did not turn a drop. Ad asher Hisir Adonai et Yisrael me'al panav, until God decided to remove the people of Israel from before him, kasher diber, as he had spoken bi'ad kol avadav hanavim, as he had told them and warned them through the prophets. Vayigel Yisrael me'al admaso Ashura ad hayom hazeh. And the people of Israel were exiled from his own land, from the land of Israel, into Assyria, and that state of existence continues until this day, says the verse. So this concludes the first half of chapter 17, the tragic end of the northern kingdom, and the explanation of the verses as to why the northern kingdom was banished. The next half of this chapter, we're going to deal with what happened to the rest of the people that weren't exiled, what happened to the people that remained that Assyria brought into the land, and what happened to that land, which was where the northern kingdom was, and the people in it after the end of the northern kingdom of Israel. Thank you so much for studying together. Looking forward to studying the rest of this chapter and, of course, the rest of this book of Kings together.